Hello everyone, and welcome back to Farms and Frontlines. I'm your host, Max Terzano, and in this special episode, I will be recording solo today. This show exists because food is never about just food. It sits at the intersection of history, policy, power, and survival. Today we're talking about what's happening right now in American fields in the spring of 2026. The United States has been at war with Iran since February 28th, Operation Epic Fury. And American farmers, already in crisis before the first bomb fell, are now caught in a perfect storm. Today we're going to do something simple and just lay out the facts. What federal agricultural programs have been cut, what they did, and what it means for the people growing our food. To understand where we are, we have to go back to early 2025, before anyone was talking about the Strait of Hormuz. In January 2025, the USDA began freezing and terminating the lawfully held contracts of farmers and farmer-serving organizations across the country, disrupting planning for the planting season. This wasn't a trimming of a program here or there. It was the beginning of a systematic restructuring of the federal government's relationship with American agriculture. Consider what happened to Skylar Holden, a 27-year-old first-generation cattle farmer in eastern Missouri. He had signed a contract with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS, for $240,000 to improve his operation. Water lines, infrastructure. He'd already spent $80,000 and signed contracts with vendors. Then the program was frozen. No one could tell him when or whether the money would come. "I made business decisions based on this contract," he said. "Going into this, if I had known they could have frozen the payments, I never would have done it." The NRCS is the agency born out of the Dust Bowl. It exists specifically to help farmers manage soil and water, to make farms more resilient. Under the administration's budget proposal, funding for conservation technical assistance was targeted to be cut from $776 million to zero. The field staff who sit across the table from farmers, help them design practices and write contracts, were to be reduced by nearly a third. Jesse Womack of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition has heard from farmers being told they have to wait 18 months just to get a conservation practice approved. Holden wasn't alone. In Massachusetts, a sheep farmer had been counting on an NRCS grant to build fencing before lambing season. His contract was frozen indefinitely. "We need to build a fence before the sheep have lambs 9 weeks from now," he said. "You can't pause nature." The staffing collapse compounded everything. Between mid-January and mid-June 2025, the USDA lost more than 20,000 employees, roughly 1 in 5 workers. The agency that collects crop and livestock production data lost 34% of its staff. The Farm Service Agency, which processes loans and disaster relief payments, lost 24%. Rural Development, which funds broadband, community facilities, and small business financing across rural America, lost 36%. The budget also proposed cutting agricultural research funding at land-grant universities by $602 million. These are the institutions developing drought-resistant seeds and training the next generation of agronomists. A quarter of that agency's own staff was gone. The director of the Agricultural Experiment Station at the University of Illinois described the uncertainty as creating an emotional toll. In eastern Iowa, the damage was immediate. A nonprofit called Iowa Valley RC&D had just launched a 2-year training program for beginning farmers. The USDA terminated their $2.4 million grant the same week the program started. Executive Director Jason Grimm said, "This is sadly the ending of a really rocky year, where the USDA, in my opinion, has degraded what farmers think of them." As Nick Lewandowski of the Kansas Farmers Union asked, "If you don't have the folks there to do the work, whether that's paperwork or following up with farmers on a project, then where do the farmers go for those services?" It's a question without a good answer right now. And then the war started. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel bombed Iran. Within 48 hours, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile-wide channel through which 20% of the world's oil travels every single day. A third of the world's fertilizer travels through that same strait, and it needs to arrive during planting season. Fertilizer is not optional for American commodity agriculture. It's the foundation of the yields that make farming economically viable. About a third of the world's globally traded urea comes from countries west of the Strait of Hormuz. And since the war began, prices have reflected that dependence. According to Oxford economists, urea prices have surged roughly 50% and ammonia around 20% since the conflict started. Diesel has climbed more than 40% as well. And here it's worth pausing because some listeners may wonder why. The US doesn't ship oil through the Strait of Hormuz, but oil is priced on a global market. As Rice University energy fellow Mark Finley put it, if something goes wrong anywhere, the price goes up everywhere. When 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply gets cut off, prices rise everywhere, including at the fuel pump in Nebraska and Iowa. For farmers running tractors, combines, and irrigation systems on diesel, there's no insulation from a global shock. Joseph Glauber, a former USDA chief economist, summarized the situation plainly. If you just look at the cash side of the business, in terms of what they received for their crops and what they have to pay out, those margins have been tight and in some cases negative. In this episode, you might hear me mention urea and potash. Urea is a nitrogen-based fertilizer, which is manufactured. It's made. It's a white granular compound and the most widely traded nitrogen fertilizer in the world. And potash, on the other hand, is a potassium-based fertilizer, and specifically potassium chloride. What's interesting about potash is it isn't synthesized, it's mined. It exists in massive underground deposits left behind by ancient evaporated seas, which is really cool. If you've listened to our past episodes, you know that this isn't the first time a war has broken the global fertilizer market. It's worth spending a moment on the comparison because it tells us something important about where we are. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, it triggered the worst disruption to global grain and fertilizer markets in decades. Russia was, and remains, the world's largest exporter of fertilizer, accounting for roughly 16% of global urea exports, and together with Belarus, about 40% of global potash exports. Almost overnight, shipping companies pulled away from Russian ports. Sanctions froze financial channels. Russia's own Ministry of Industry and Trade recommended its fertilizer manufacturers temporarily halt exports. The result? Urea hit $925 per metric ton by spring 2022. Anhydrous ammonia topped $1,635 per ton at U.S. retail. Potash jumped 53% in just 3 months. The Black Sea itself became a weapon. Ukraine, which supplied nearly half the world's sunflower oil, 17% of its barley, and 12% of its corn, saw its grain piling up in silos with no safe passage out. The UN warned that 47 million people were pushed towards acute food insecurity. The FAO Food Price Index hit a record high in March 2022. Markets and diplomats scrambled. Brazil pivoted its potash imports from Belarus to Canada. Morocco replaced Russian ammonia with shipments from Saudi Arabia and Egypt. The EU eased financial sanctions to let some Russian fertilizers move. And in July 2022, after months of diplomacy led by Turkey and the United Nations, Russia and Ukraine signed the Black Sea Grain Initiative, a negotiated corridor that allowed cargo ships to move safely from 3 Ukrainian ports. Over the next year, nearly 33 million metric tons of grain moved through that corridor to 45 countries. By June 2023, the FAO Food Price Index had fallen more than 23% from its peak. Fertilizer prices, which had hit record highs, returned to near pre-invasion levels by early 2023. The system, in other words, adapted. It was painful and imperfect, and the deal eventually collapsed when Russia pulled out in July 2023. But the combination of diplomatic intervention, market substitution, and emergency logistics managed to blunt the worst of the crisis. Now look at 2026. Economists at North Dakota State University and the University of Illinois have both published direct comparisons, and their conclusions are sobering. The Strait of Hormuz crisis may ultimately prove harder to resolve than the Black Sea crisis for 2 structural reasons. First, there's no diplomatic off-ramp equivalent to the Grain Initiative. The Black Sea deal required 2 belligerents, a neutral broker, and a UN framework. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's sovereign territory, shut by an active combatant with no third-party corridor agreement in sight. As the Carnegie Endowment noted, unlike the oil market, which has no strategic reserves and escort programs, there's no strategic reserves of urea, no alternate pipelines for ammonia, and no military escort program for fertilizer ships. Second, and perhaps more damaging for farmers, in 2022, grain prices rose sharply alongside fertilizer costs. Russia and Ukraine together supplied roughly 30% of global wheat exports and 20% of corn exports. So when the Black Sea closed, crop values spiked, partially offsetting the higher input costs. Farmers were squeezed, but at least the crop they grew was worth more. In 2026, Iran is not a major grain exporter. Grain prices have risen only modestly, 2 to 7% across corn, wheat, and soybeans. Fertilizer costs are up 40 to 50%. The squeeze is asymmetric in a way 2022 was not. As NDSU economists wrote bluntly, the Black Sea grain disruptions that drove crop prices sharply higher in 2022 have no parallel here, meaning there's no corresponding revenue offset for farmers facing rising input costs. David Hale, a portfolio manager at 91, who covers global natural resources, put it plainly to CNBC. That's why I'm a lot more concerned about the current crisis than I was when Russia-Ukraine happened 4 years ago. There's one more dimension worth naming, and it connects directly to the theme of the show. Russia is the quiet beneficiary of this moment. It accounts for 23% of global ammonia exports and 14% of global urea exports, supplies that aren't moving through the strait. As Carnegie analysts noted, the Kremlin has already declared that Russia is one of the few countries that can ensure a growing market supply. In 2022, Russia used the grain deal as diplomatic leverage over African and Middle Eastern governments. In 2026, with a new choke point and a new crisis, it has a fresh opportunity to convert food market power into geopolitical influence. The countries calling Moscow for urea deliveries aren't thinking about the Iran war. They're thinking about their planting windows. This is what a fragile global system looks like under stress. The same choke point dependency that made 2022 a crisis is making 2026 a potentially deeper one. And the farmers caught in the middle, in Iowa, in Nebraska, in Massachusetts, are not the one who designed the system. They're the ones paying for it. This past week, President Trump requested a 10% cut in non-defense spending for the 2027 fiscal year and a massive $500 billion increase in the military budget as the U.S. continues its war against Iran. The administration planned major cuts to fund defense, targeting energy grants, education, agriculture, and other domestic programs. Speaking ahead of an address about the Iran war, President Trump signaled his priorities directly. "We're fighting wars. We can't take care of daycare," he said. "It's not possible for us to take care of daycare, Medicaid, Medicare, all these individual things." The farm safety net programs that remain, crop insurance, commodity price reports, are mandatory spending and not on the immediate chopping block. But the discretionary programs that help farmers adapt, innovate, access markets, and survive lean years have been systematically reduced. And now the war is consuming resources and attention that might otherwise address the farm crisis. Farm bankruptcies have nearly doubled between 2024 and 2025. Vanessa Garcia Polanco of the National Young Farmers Coalition put it plainly. "The farmers I work with, they know what they're signing up for. They know it's hard work. They know it's a lot of labor. They know they can barely break even. But there's only so many times you can take a hit and not fall apart." So the question is, who pays for all this? In wartime, the answer is rarely the people making the decisions. It's usually the people closest to the land. The programs cut over the past year, conservation support, agricultural research, rural development, beginning farmer training, they're not glamorous. They didn't generate headlines, but they were the connective tissue between federal policy and the actual work of farming. And they're gone, or diminished, at the moment farmers need them the most. We'll be keeping an eye on this, and we'll link sources in the show notes. If you have any questions, please write us at farmsandfrontlines@gmail.com and follow our newsletter to see all of our sources. You don't need to sign up, but you can visit farmsandfrontlines.substack.com to get a recap of this episode and all the sources we use. Thanks for listening.